November 3rd, 1943. 6:47 in the morning. The mesquite-dotted plains of West Texas stretched flat and endless under a sky so pale it looked bleached, the kind of sky that made a man feel small even if he stood 6 feet tall. A wind came steady from the northwest, carrying the smell of cattle and dry grass, and with it, a sound that didn't belong. The rhythmic shuffle of 200 men in worn boots walking in formation, their breath forming small clouds in the 40-degree air. They wore denim work clothes stamped with large PW letters across their backs, their faces weathered by a Pacific sun that bore no resemblance to this Texas dawn, showed neither hope nor despair, but something more unsettling. The blank acceptance of men who had stopped expecting anything at all. At the front of the column, a young Japanese officer named Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, where a massive ranch operation sprawled across 12,000 acres of Coleman County rangeland. He had been told they would work. He had not been told they would learn. What happened in the next 8 months would become one of the war's quietest rebellions against expectation, not through violence or escape, but through the strange alchemy of shared skill and grudging respect, played out in a place where the rules of the Pacific Theater meant nothing, and the only language that mattered was the one spoken between a man and a half-ton of muscle and horn. Takeshi Yamamoto was 26 years old, the third son of a rice farmer from Niigata Prefecture, a place of snow-heavy winters and terraced paddies that climbed hillsides like green staircases. Before the war, he had been an accountant in Tokyo, a man who worked with numbers and margins, who rode the Yamanote line each morning in a pressed suit and ate cold rice balls at his desk. He was not a warrior by temperament. His wire-rimmed glasses and slender build had made him an unlikely candidate for military glory, but conscription cared nothing for temperament. He had learned to march, to salute, to follow orders with the mechanical precision expected of an Imperial Army officer. He had learned, too, not to ask questions. His war had ended on February 18, 1943, on Guadalcanal, when exhaustion and malaria reduced his unit to 37 men from an original 200. He had surrendered, not with shame, but with the numb finality of a man watching his own death from a distance. The Americans had processed him through holding facilities in the South Pacific, then transported him by ship and rail across half a world to a place whose name he couldn't pronounce. Coleman, Texas. Population 5,500. The nearest ocean, 950 miles in any direction. Camp Hereford, as the Americans called it, sat on leased ranch land owned by the Bartholomew family, who had run cattle in Coleman County since 1879. The camp itself was a collection of tar paper barracks, a mess hall, a small infirmary, and guard towers manned by soldiers deemed unfit for overseas duty. Men over 40, men with flat feet, men whose war was being fought in the mesquite flats of Texas rather than the jungles of the Pacific. The POWs, numbering 241 by late autumn of 1943, had been designated for agricultural labor under the Geneva Convention's provision that prisoners could be required to work, provided it was not directly related to military operations. But this was not the work Yamamoto had expected. The fall of 1943 was a moment of peculiar tension in the broader arc of World War II. In the Pacific, American forces had secured Guadalcanal and were preparing for the bloody island-hopping campaigns that would define the next 2 years. In Europe, the Allies had invaded Italy, and the bombing campaign over Germany was intensifying. The home front in the United States faced acute labor shortages. More than 12 million men had been mobilized for military service, leaving farms, ranches, and factories desperate for workers. Texas, with its vast ranching operations, was particularly affected. Cattle prices were at wartime highs. Beef was essential to the war effort, but there weren't enough hands to work the herds. The solution arrived in the form of Executive Order 9423, which allowed POWs to fill civilian labor gaps. By the end of 1943, there were approximately 425,000 Axis prisoners in camps across the United States, with Texas hosting more than 70,000, divided among 33 main camps and numerous branch camps. Most performed agricultural work, picking cotton, harvesting crops, clearing land. The arrangement was pragmatic, not philosophical. The ranchers needed workers. The government needed somewhere to house prisoners. The prisoners needed something other than the slow psychological death of idleness. What made Camp Hereford unusual was not the labor itself, but the nature of it, and more specifically, the men who would teach it. James "Red" McKittrick was 54 years old, a third-generation Texas rancher whose hands looked like weathered saddle leather and whose silence was legendary, even in a culture that valued taciturnity. He stood 5'10", bow-legged from 50 years in the saddle, and possessed a startling ability with a rope that had made him a regional rodeo champion in his youth. He had 3 sons in the war, one in North Africa, one in the Pacific, one in England, preparing for what everyone knew was coming. He had not wanted Japanese prisoners on his land. He had been outvoted by economics and government contracts. But if they were going to be there, he told the camp commandant, a weary army captain named Harrison Boyle, they would damn well learn to work cattle properly, or they wouldn't work at all. The other ranchers in the cooperative, the Lundquists, the Hernandezes, the Bishops, felt much the same. This was not charity. This was necessity, dressed up as compliance with international law. The prisoners would be useful, or they would be returned to whatever useless confinement the government had planned for them elsewhere. The crisis began not with a single moment, but with a grinding, accumulating realization over the first 3 weeks of November. The POWs had been assigned to work cattle rotations, herding, separating calves from their mothers for weaning, moving stock between winter pastures. It was work that required not brute strength, but skill, timing, and an understanding of animal behavior that could not be taught in a manual. The prisoners had none of it. Yamamoto watched his men struggle with growing frustration. They approached cattle like they were moving furniture, stiffly, hesitantly, with no sense of how pressure and release worked with livestock. Cows bolted, calves scattered, gates were left open. A young private named Kenji Tanaka was nearly trampled when he tried to force a steer into a chute by pushing it from behind rather than guiding it from the side. The animal wheeled, caught Tanaka with its shoulder, and sent him sprawling into the mud. Tanaka was unhurt, but humiliated, and that night, Yamamoto heard him weeping quietly in his bunk. The Americans watched with varying degrees of irritation and amusement. Some of the guards made jokes. One of the Bartholomew Ranch hands, a man named Cooper, openly laughed when a calf dodged 3 prisoners and jumped a fence they'd forgotten to secure. But Red McKittrick didn't laugh. He watched with the focused attention of a man assessing a problem that needed solving. On the morning of November 22nd, he approached Captain Boyle with a proposition that sounded insane the moment it was spoken aloud. "They need to learn to rope," McKittrick said. Boyle, a former high school principal from Pennsylvania, who understood nothing about cattle and less about cowboys, stared at him. "Rope. You can't work cattle proper without a rope," McKittrick said. "Can't sort them, can't doctor them, can't move them when they don't want to move. Right now, your boys are about as useful as tits on a boar hog." You want to teach enemy prisoners of war to use lassos. I want to teach workers to do the work they're here to do, McKittrick corrected. Otherwise, you're wasting my time and theirs. Boyle considered the request through multiple lenses: security risk, public relations disaster, potential violation of some regulation he was certain existed. But he was also a practical man who had been ordered to make this arrangement work, and it was manifestly not working. The beef quota was not being met. The prisoners were demoralized and accident-prone. Something had to change. No metal Hondas, Boyle said finally. Rope only, and you teach them on calves first. Nothing big enough to drag a man. McKittrick nodded. Fair enough. What neither man fully understood was that they had just authorized one of the stranger cultural exchanges of the war. One that would be documented in exactly 3 photographs, 2 letters, and the spotty memories of men who would spend the next 60 years trying to explain it to children and grandchildren who could never quite believe it was real. The first lesson took place on November 24th, the day before Thanksgiving. The sky was low and gray, threatening rain that wouldn't come for another 2 days. 16 prisoners, selected by Yamamoto for their physical coordination and willingness to try something that made no sense, stood in a rough semicircle in a practice pen, while Red McKittrick built a loop in a 30-foot manila rope with the practiced ease of a man tying his shoes. He didn't speak much. Instead, he demonstrated. The rope spun above his head in a flat, whirring circle, building speed, then shot forward and dropped over a fence post 20 feet away with a soft slap. He pulled it tight, then loosened it and coiled it again. Simple, inevitable, like watching water find a drain. Then he handed the rope to Yamamoto. Yamamoto took it, feeling the weight and texture, rougher than any rope he'd handled in Japan, thicker, alive somehow with potential energy. He tried to copy McKittrick's motion. The loop sagged, tangled, fell at his feet. Behind him, one of the prisoners made a small sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Yamamoto's face remained blank. McKittrick retrieved the rope, rebuilt the loop, handed it back. This time he stood beside Yamamoto, placing the young officer's hands in the correct positions, adjusting his wrist angle. Like this, he said. Not an order, just information. Yamamoto tried again. The loop made half a rotation before collapsing, but it was half a rotation more than before. They worked for 3 hours that first day. No one successfully roped anything. But by the end, 12 of the 16 prisoners could keep a loop spinning for 5 or 6 rotations, and one, a former fisherman named Hiro Matsuda, who had spent his youth casting nets in Hokkaido, managed to drop a loop over a stationary barrel. McKittrick said nothing, but Yamamoto noticed he nodded once before he walked away. The learning curve was steep and humbling. The prisoners practiced every afternoon for 2 hours after the regular work ended, their hands developing blisters and then calluses, their shoulders aching from the repetitive motion. The rope was unforgiving. It showed every flaw in technique, every moment of hesitation or overconfidence. But it was also weirdly honest. It didn't care that they were prisoners. It didn't care that they were Japanese. It cared only whether they understood weight, momentum, and timing. By mid-December, 10 of them could rope a moving calf with reasonable consistency. By January, they were being used in actual work rotations, assisting with sorting and medical checks. The change was subtle, but unmistakable. The prisoners moved differently around the cattle now, with confidence born not from arrogance, but from competence. They understood, finally, what the Americans had been trying to tell them, without words. That working cattle was not about domination, but about partnership, about reading an animal's intentions, and responding before the animal even knew what it was going to do. The cowboys, for their part, began to thaw. Red McKittrick remained taciturn, but his corrections became more detailed, more patient. He would demonstrate a technique 3 times if that's what it took. One afternoon in late January, when Yamamoto successfully roped a calf on the first throw, McKittrick said, "Good," and the word hung in the cold air, like an award. Other moments of connection appeared like green shoots through snow. One of the younger ranch hands, a man named Billy Stinson, whose brother had been killed at Pearl Harbor, taught Kenji Tanaka how to tie a Honda knot properly. Tanaka, in return, showed Stinson how to fold a shirt using the precise method he'd learned in the Imperial Army. Efficient, compact, practical. They never discussed the war. They discussed knots and shirts, which were safe and real and mattered in the moment they occupied. There was no declaration of friendship. There were no speeches about common humanity. There was only the shared language of work, and slowly, grudgingly, that was enough. The climactic moment came not in triumph, but in crisis, on a bitter morning in late February 1944. A late winter storm had blown through overnight, dropping temperatures into the teens and coating everything with a thin layer of ice. A section of fence on the western boundary had collapsed under the weight of frozen mesquite limbs, and approximately 60 head of cattle had wandered onto adjoining land owned by a rancher named Elias Pruitt, who was known for 2 things: shooting first and tolerating trespass not at all. By the time the fence break was discovered at dawn, the cattle were scattered across 200 acres of Pruitt's winter pasture, mixing with his own herd. The situation required immediate action, not just to retrieve the Bartholomew cattle, but to do it before Pruitt woke up, found Bartholomew's stock on his land, and decided to settle the matter in the traditional way, which involved a rifle and a property line. Red McKittrick assembled a crew at 6:30 a.m., himself, 2 of his regular hands, and, here was the moment of either genius or insanity, 4 of the prisoners, including Yamamoto and Matsuda. They were the best ropers, and speed mattered more than politics this morning. They rode out in the pre-dawn darkness, breath steaming, horses stepping carefully on the ice-glazed ground. No one spoke. The prisoners had been given temporary mounts, older, steady horses that wouldn't spook easily, and they sat in the saddles with the uncertain grace of men still learning a skill they'd been practicing for only 3 months. The work began in the half-light, with McKittrick and his hands identifying the Bartholomew cattle by ear tags and brands. The prisoners' job was to rope and hold the animals while they were sorted and driven back through the gap in the fence. It required precision. A bad throw could spook the entire herd, and 60 head of panicked cattle in icy conditions could kill someone without meaning to. Yamamoto roped the first animal, a yearling heifer, that broke from the group and tried to run deeper into Pruitt's land. His loop settled over her neck on the second throw, and he dallied the rope around his saddle horn the way McKittrick had taught him, letting the horse do the work of stopping the animal's momentum. The heifer pulled, the rope went taut, the horse set its weight. The heifer stopped. Yamamoto held her steady, while one of the hands moved her toward the fence opening. They worked for 90 minutes, moving with the careful urgency of men who knew they were racing both daylight and discovery. Matsuda roped a bull calf that tried to dodge back into Pruitt's herd. Tanaka, working on foot, caught a spooked cow that had tangled itself in loose wire. One by one, the Bartholomew cattle were identified, secured, and moved. At 8:15, with 43 head recovered and moving through the fence gap, a truck appeared on the ridge above Pruitt's house. They didn't wait to see if it was Pruitt or just a ranch hand. McKittrick made a sharp gesture, and they abandoned the remaining cattle, driving what they had as fast as the ice and footing would allow, back onto Bartholomew land. They didn't stop until they were a quarter-mile past the fence line. Only then did McKittrick pull up, dismount, and assess the group. 4 men, himself and the 3 hands, 4 prisoners, 7 horses, 43 head of retrieved cattle, 0 injuries, 0 lost animals, 0 shots fired. He looked at Yamamoto, who was breathing hard, his glasses fogged, his hands still gripping the coiled rope like it was the only solid thing in an uncertain world. "You did good," McKittrick said. Yamamoto nodded once, unable to speak, unsure what acknowledgement was permitted or appropriate. They rode back to the ranch in silence, but it was a different silence than the one they'd ridden out in. It was the silence of men who had worked together and survived together, which is its own kind of language. By the spring of 1944, the arrangement at Camp Hereford had become routine enough that it stopped being noteworthy. The prisoners worked cattle. The ranchers paid the government contract rates. The beef quota was met. Occasionally, visitors from other camps would arrive and watch the prisoners roping calves with genuine competence, and they would shake their heads in disbelief before returning to their own operations, where prisoners picked cotton or dug irrigation ditches or did any of the 1,000 other jobs that didn't require cultural translation. In May, 3 prisoners, including Matsuda, were awarded first place in an informal ranch rodeo competition against crews from neighboring operations. The prize was a side of beef for the camp mess hall, and a photograph that ran in the Coleman Democrat Voice under the headline, "POWs Show Roping Skills." The article was 5 sentences long and mentioned neither their names nor their nationality. The photograph showed 3 men in denim with PW on their backs, holding coiled ropes, standing beside a fence. They weren't smiling, but they weren't blank either. They looked like men who had learned something useful. That summer, Captain Boyle received a letter from the International Red Cross, inquiring about conditions at Camp Hereford. The inspection that followed was routine and brief. The inspector noted that prisoners were engaged in agricultural labor, that living conditions met Geneva Convention standards, that no complaints had been filed. In his report, he included one additional observation. The prisoners appear to have developed significant skill in livestock management, which may prove useful in post-war agricultural reconstruction efforts in Japan. The report was filed, copied, and forgotten. The war ended in August 1945. The prisoners at Camp Hereford were processed for repatriation over the next 4 months, shipped to holding facilities in California, then transported across the Pacific to a homeland that had been transformed by fire and defeat into something they barely recognized. Yamamoto returned to find Tokyo, a landscape of ash and rubble, his parents' home in Niigata still standing, but surrounded by fields that had been neglected for years. His sister had survived. His younger brother had not. He did not return to accounting. There were no offices left to work in, no economy that needed accountants yet. Instead, he did what thousands of repatriated soldiers did. He went to the countryside and tried to grow food. The government was encouraging agricultural development, trying to feed a nation on the edge of starvation. In 1947, he was assigned to a cooperative farm project in Hokkaido, where the government was experimenting with Western-style ranching techniques as part of the reconstruction effort. The first time he saw cattle being worked by farmers who had no idea how to move them efficiently, he felt a strange recognition. He asked if anyone knew how to use a rope. No one did, so he taught them. He had no materials, so he made rope from rice straw, twisted and braided, with the care he'd learned from Red McKittrick. He had no cattle to practice on except the actual working stock, so they learned by doing, the way he had. The loops were smaller, the cattle were different breeds, the climate was colder and wetter. But the principles were the same: pressure and release, timing, the loop spinning flat and fast before it drops. By 1950, the cooperative was using rope-based handling techniques regularly. By 1955, it had spread to 3 other operations in the region. No one called it cowboy technique. They called it Yamamoto's method, or sometimes just rope handling. The origin story was not discussed. The war was something people did not talk about, especially not to explain farming techniques. Yamamoto never spoke publicly about his time in Texas. He married in 1953, had 2 daughters, worked the cooperative farm until his retirement in 1982. In 1988, a young Japanese television reporter, doing a documentary on agricultural modernization, interviewed him about the cooperative's history. She asked how he had learned rope techniques. "In America," he said. "During the war." "As a prisoner?" "Yes." "They taught you?" He paused, and for a moment he was 26 again, standing in a practice pen with a rope in his hands that wouldn't do what he wanted, watching a bow-legged cowboy demonstrate patience that made no sense according to everything he'd been taught about how enemies were supposed to treat each other. "They taught me," he confirmed. The interview aired in a late-night slot and was seen by approximately 40,000 people. It generated no follow-up stories. Yamamoto died in 2003 at the age of 86, leaving no written account of his experiences at Camp Hereford. Red McKittrick worked the Bartholomew Ranch until 1961, when arthritis and age finally convinced him that 57 years in the saddle was probably enough. He moved to town, lived in a small house near his daughter, and spent his final years watching the Coleman County rodeo every summer with the critical eye of a man who knew how things should be done. He died in 1974. His obituary in the Coleman Democrat Voice mentioned his rodeo championships, his ranching career, and his 3 sons who had served in World War II. It did not mention that he had taught Japanese prisoners to rope cattle, because no one thought to ask, and he had never thought to mention it. Of the 16 prisoners who learned to rope at Camp Hereford, at least 8 are known to have returned to agricultural work in Japan. 3 became involved in the development of Japan's post-war cattle industry, which modernized significantly in the 1950s and 1960s. Whether their training in Texas had any direct influence on these developments is impossible to verify, because the men who might have confirmed it are dead, and the records that might have documented it were either never created or were destroyed in the routine purges of military files that followed the war. What remains are fragments. 3 photographs in the Coleman County Historical Society archives, showing prisoners working cattle alongside American cowboys. A brief mention in a Red Cross report. A few letters written by guards who worked at Camp Hereford, now held by their descendants, describing the strange sight of Japanese soldiers learning to rope. And the memories of a handful of people who were children in Coleman in the 1940s and remember seeing prisoners in denim with PW on their backs, working cattle like they'd been born to it. There is no monument to this story. No historical marker stands at the site where Camp Hereford once operated. The buildings were dismantled in 1946, and the land returned to ranching. The Bartholomew Ranch is still in operation, now run by the 4th and 5th generations of the family. None of them know the details of what happened there in 1943 and 1944. It was wartime. People did what needed to be done. The cattle were worked. The prisoners went home. Life continued. But sometimes history doesn't announce itself with monuments or markers. Sometimes it happens quietly, in moments of practical necessity and grudging respect, when two groups of men who had every reason to see each other as nothing but enemies discovered that they could see each other as something else. Not friends exactly, but not enemies either. Workers, teachers, and students. Men who shared a language that had nothing to do with English or Japanese, and everything to do with rope and cattle, and the strange alchemy of skill passed from one set of hands to another. The war taught millions of people how to kill, how to destroy, how to survive the unsurvivable. But in a small corner of West Texas, for a brief window of time, it also taught a handful of men something different: how to build a loop, read an animal, work together toward a common goal that mattered in the moment more than the flags they'd fought under, or the hatreds they'd been taught to carry. They learned to rope instead of work chains, and in that small act of unexpected grace, they proved that even in war, even between enemies, the possibility of teaching and learning, of seeing each other as something more than ideology demanded, could survive. Not easily, not perfectly, but genuinely. And that, perhaps, is worth remembering, even if no one thought to carve it in stone.